Hello everyone, it is Tuesday and I am on the road. I am in my car right now. I just got off the ferry, a few minutes late because my ferry was late, but that's how traveling goes. I wanted to try and do Tuesday tea time as usual before I get else. And I'm going to be in Germany next week and then Portugal the week after that. And I thought we'd have a little chat today about a really interesting topic that a student of mine brought up, which I've been sort of mulling over all week ever since we talked about it. And I thought you guys might enjoy it as well. And this is the question: is intrinsic or extrinsic motivation better? And of course the answer is it depends. But what does it depend on? What is intrinsic motivation and what is extrinsic motivation? So motivation is just, why would you do something or change something? And as trainers, we want our horses to do something or change something quite frequently. So intrinsic motivation is about how it feels. And feeling is all about the five senses: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling. It's a very rich way of living life. And so intrinsic motivation is really what's most interesting to me in my training. But I don't think that makes it better than extrinsic motivation. So what's extrinsic motivation? Extrinsic motivation is where something is added or subtracted from your exterior life. Now, there's some argument that all extrinsic motivation is to some degree intrinsic, because what happens externally to you will also trigger something internally. So a really obvious example would be food rewards. So when we use food rewards in animal training, we are adding food to their life at a specific time that's going to make a behavior more likely to be repeated. So extrinsic motivation, that adding of food, is going to really encourage them. It's going to motivate them to do something more often or to change something more often. So I don't focus very much on extrinsic motivation. It's not very interesting to me, but that doesn't mean that it's worse than intrinsic motivation. It's different. So intrinsic motivation is usually the memory of an associated feeling without really having the link anymore. So when people do food reward training and they extinct the need for the food, so they've trained with food for a long enough time that they've created a behavior, and then slowly they extinct the need for the food, that's when it becomes intrinsic motivation, if they've truly extincted the need for the food. What I notice is that there's very, very few trainers in the world that are actually skilled enough to do that. So it's beautiful when it happens, but most trainers I see have to keep going back to the extrinsic motivator to keep cementing it in. So you can start to extinct the food, but then you got to bring it back, and then you can start to, and then you got to bring it back. And to actually meet a trainer that's skilled enough to completely extinct the need for the food and only have the intrinsic motivator left, it's very, very rare. What I am looking for is what are the ways to train where we could most lean into intrinsic motivators, where I want the horse to feel like it's rewarding itself by how it feels. And then we mark a behavior simply by giving them really time to remember how they felt good when something happened. But it's not a feeling I gave them. It's not something I added. It's not a feeling I took, where I took pressure away so they felt better. I didn't influence the feeling. The feeling happened naturally. They were going to feel good anyway, regardless of what I did or didn't do. And then I mark it and I pay attention to it. So you could say my marking it and paying attention to it is sort of an extrinsic motivator. I can add my attention. I don't think you could ever unlink extrinsic and intrinsic. They're a little bit linked, but which one do we focus on? And the question, is one better than the other? So the way I see it is that the thing that's better is the thing you haven't had enough of. And so in our lives, human, horse, relationships, all of these things, you want the stuff you feel like you haven't had enough of. And that just comes from the experience. Anything that is done too much, you want less of. And anything that is done not enough, you want more of. And so we get a little bit addicted to the things that have not been sufficient, not been fully satisfying in our life, and we want more and more and more of it. This, I think, is my obsession with intrinsic motivation. I am fascinated by behaviors that animals choose just because they feel good, not because somebody else made them feel good or somebody else caused them to feel good. But what about the stuff that they just remember as being stuff they like doing? Whether it's looking at the view or smelling the wind or being close to another horse, or, what if it's just stuff they like doing that they no longer know why they like doing it? They just like it. That's fascinating to me. And it's fascinating to me because I feel like I've tasted it. I feel like I've had moments where I went, oh, I can see how that formed. I can see what it's like. And I want more of that. I want to spend more time with horses that are using their five senses and enjoying their lives. And they're motivated to do the things they do just because it feels good. So this is fascinating to me. And this is what I study, and this is what I teach. I don't think it's better than being externally motivated, where somebody can actually cause you to feel better. Someone can actually, whether it's through positive or negative reinforcement, whether it's the taking away of pressure or the adding of something good to your life, they're a little bit interlinked. I think it's really hard to separate them out as much as people think they're attempting to separate them out. Extrinsic motivation is going to be really interesting to people who feel like they've seen it, they've felt it, and they want more of it. And then it's going to be better. So we're going to have different camps of people and different camps of horses who prefer extrinsic motivation or prefer intrinsic motivation. What's the healthiest? Probably an equal balance of both. So we have some things we do in our lives just because they feel good, and we don't even remember why they have that positive association. They just do. And to really value those and value them in our partners. And, if I have a horse that I know loves taking time to stop and smell the smells on the wind, I want to do that with him. It just feels good. Now that same wind is blowing and there's 5 other horses in the herd that don't have a good association with that. It's there, but it doesn't have the same intrinsic motivation to do that. I'm really fascinated by that, and I want as much of that in my relationships with horses as possible. And then I want to link the things I want to do to really good feelings, whether I want to ride them, or I want to gallop down a beach, or I want to ride through the forest, or I want to move horses from one pasture to the next. Any of the simple, mundane things. We could do it because after we do it, I make them feel better, or after we do it, I release some tension off of them. Those are extrinsic motivators. Not bad, not wrong, just not as interesting to me. Christian says, I guess extrinsic is a need for horses as they need other herd members to guarantee safety for everyone. Yes, you've got it, Christian. So extrinsic motivators are what link herd members together. So we are social creatures. And when we use extrinsic motivators to develop behaviors or develop change or do training, we're going to instantly feel more connected because our partners are doing what we want. And that is a feeling of connection. That's very valid, and horses are herd animals, so it works really well with them. I am more fascinated by, instead of me creating the connection where the horse does what I want, what if I just mark the behaviors they would do anyway, naturally, normally, and mark those behaviors specifically as things that I want. And I'm not going to mark them by adding something to their life, like a food or a scratch. I'm just going to keep them company. Now, keeping them company would be an extrinsic motivator. That's the interesting thing. But the subtlety of keeping them company is I don't distract them from the feelings they're feeling. I don't change the feelings they're feeling. All I do is keep them company while they feel them. And that is where the emphasis becomes the intrinsic motivation versus the extrinsic motivation. In the extrinsic motivation, I am going to take an active part in changing the way that they feel, either by adding something good or taking away something bad. And I don't like extrinsic motivation as much because it puts a lot of pressure on me to keep shaping the horse in a way that maybe they wouldn't want to shape themselves. Now, ultimately, they're social creatures. So if they feel more connected to others, they do want that. But I really am curious, like, how would they want to connect with humans being their horsey selves? And could we appreciate that to the point where we could really gently touch the extrinsic motivators and build into stuff I want to do? But that's not most of the relationship. Most of the relationship is the intrinsic motivators of why we want to be there. We want to be together just because it feels good. We don't even know why. Extrinsically, yeah, there's going to be some things like when I smell the wind, my human stops and pauses to be the same as me and smell the wind with me. That stopping and pausing and matching them is an extrinsic motivator because they're very, very social. But as long as I'm not distracting them from their internal feelings, we start emphasizing the internal more than we're emphasizing the external. And so it is, isn't it, Kristen? It's really an interesting topic to think about. And I'm sure there's lots and lots of different ways we could look at it. I do think it's always connected. And I do think that extrinsic is going to lead to social connection faster. And horses are very social creatures. They need a herd. Intrinsic motivation is more about the individual first, then becoming part of the social structure. I think extrinsic motivation tends to be more about let's adapt to the social structure first and then be an individual second. One isn't better than the other. Some sort of balance would be good because we're all social and we all want to integrate with others and have some sort of harmony and flow. It's part of our nature, both humans and horses. What is the balance between we're motivated to do something because somebody else makes our life better or worse, or we're motivated to do something just because it feels good, or feels right, and we don't even remember why that link happened? I'm more interested in the second, the intrinsic motivation. But I want to acknowledge that extrinsic motivation has a great deal of value and for some situations might be better than intrinsic motivation. but everybody gets to choose. And I think that there are tons and tons and tons of brilliant horse trainers in the world right now teaching you how to do better extrinsic motivation. There's not a whole lot of us talking about how you tap into the intrinsic motivation. And I would like to keep propelling all of us to think in that direction. Some sort of balance between the things we do just because they feel good. We don't even remember why they feel good. They just do. And the things we do because there's a specific link. I have to do this to get that. And that extrinsic, I have to do this to get that way of being is going to create a very nicely connected society. So I'm at a time in my life, I want to focus individuals first, society second. But that's not always the way it is. Sometimes you want to focus society first, individual second. Can we get along? Can we all think together? Can we all cooperate? Can we all work together? And then build into individualism later. Christian, I love that you are on this with me. He says, I think intrinsic is more likely when all fundamental needs are fulfilled. So you don't think about those anymore. Yeah, I agree. And so if you really want to think about intrinsic motivation, you're going to have to really consider whether the fundamental needs are filled first. Because if there's any question about the fundamental needs being met, then the horse is going to reach for more society connections to get their fundamental needs met. What do I have to do to make sure I have enough food, to make sure I have enough water, to make sure I have enough friends, to make sure I have all my basic needs met? They're only going to think as individuals once they have their basic needs met. And they're going to do whatever they need to do to satisfy everyone around them. They're going to be extrinsically motivated if they feel like any of those basic needs are not being met. Yula says, for me, patience is very often the skill that's missing when waiting for the horse to develop intrinsic motivation. Yeah. So patience is really interesting. When we need to be more patient, it's usually because we haven't noticed enough interesting details. So when you are noticing enough interesting details, you no longer have enough time to gather all the information you want. And you no longer have to be patient because you only have 5 minutes to gather a huge amount of data, a huge amount of information. There's not enough time to gather all the information you want. So if you can really get focused on learning more in every minute that you spend with your horse, you will find that you're not impatient anymore. Where we get impatient is where we wish the horse would learn more faster. So when we want the horse to change or we want the horse to be different, it's really easy to get impatient because you see what they're like and you know how you want them to be. And then you start turning to more extrinsic motivators. And that might be perfectly healthy. But if we as humans want to be the ones who are the learners, who are learning more about our horses, learning more about the situation, learning more about the relationship, then you have barely enough time in every interaction to gather as much information as you need to be able to appreciate them as they are instead of trying to change them. And I think that that's really the big difference between intrinsic, when we're training intrinsic motivation in the horse, we are really trying to learn enough about the horse that we know about their rhythms and their patterns and their cycles. We know what happens, we know what happens next, and we know what one thing leads to another thing. If we can see the sequences and the patterns and the predictions, then we can be in the right place at the right time to reinforce the behaviors that we particularly like. That's the little bit of extrinsic motivation added on top of their intrinsic motivation if they're just doing what they like. They're not trying to make anybody happy. They're just doing whatever it is that they want. But if we don't have enough information to know what happens next, we're never in the right place at the right time to really reinforce, yes, remember that. Because that's what intrinsic motivation is. Remember the thing that you enjoyed so you can do it again. And we can add just a little bit of extrinsic motivation by noticing the stuff the horse did that made them feel better or safer or whatever it is they felt using their sensory system. If we're in the right place at the right time to mark it, then it starts to happen more often. And Kristen says this need time. Yep, and patience, as Eula said. So making sure a horse's needs are filled, yeah, it takes some time, but it only takes patience if you start wanting the horse to change more than you want to gather information. If you want to gather information about all the details of every moment that happens, you won't need patience anymore. You'll just need time. So yeah, it is interesting, Kristen. All the different motivators will overlap. And then you get to decide, what do I want to emphasize? And I think from all the thinking I've been doing this week, I've come to the conclusion that if you want to prioritize the individual, you're going to prioritize the intrinsic motivation. If you want to prioritize the community or the partnerships, then you might prioritize the extrinsic motivation. I'm fascinated by the intrinsic, but I do acknowledge there's a balance. So hopefully that's some good food for thought for you guys. Yes, you'll have patience with yourself too, learning to notice the details. I find it's amazing when I start noticing things and I think, oh, that has been happening in front of me for years and I never noticed it. I noticed a lot of things, but I never noticed it. You ever do that thing where you're running your hands over your horse and all of a sudden you see like a weird lump or a weird divot and you think, did they hurt themselves? Or has their leg always been shaped that way? And then you have to go back and you look at pictures and you're like, oh yeah, it's always been there. There's always been a lump or a divot there. And I've just never noticed it. That's when you realize how many things you miss every moment. So if we're feeling impatient, we got to be patient with ourselves, but gather a little bit more information. It's just about noticing things you didn't notice before. And I'm a work in progress like everybody. So thank you guys. Hopefully that's good food for thought. I'm going to get on the road now and my next tea time should be from Germany. So have a wonderful day, everyone.